Hi, Professor Michael. Thank you so much for joining me today to discuss your exciting new research that came out in Nature Medicine. Please, could you tell me what challenges does your research address?
I think for a while now, we've known, even quite early on in the pandemic, that after hospitalization with COVID-19, many patients complained of cognitive symptoms, often termed brain fog. But what's been less clear is whether there are objectively measurable cognitive impairments in these patients. And if there are there any evidence of biological injury? And crucially, do these patients recover over time? Also, it had been assumed that those patients who had a clear neurological diagnostic complication of COVID-19, like a stroke, might be those with greatest cognitive impairment. Um, and really understanding the impacts of COVID and COVID neurological complications really gives us insights both into the mechanistic processes that might be underlying this, but also how clinicians can support patients better over time.
Definitely. And how did you address these challenges in the study?
So we were a nationwide study based here in the UK. We recruited just over 800 patients with COVID-19 who'd been hospitalized, about half of whom who had neurological complications. We were able to follow them up longitudinally, and just over 350 saw us in person and online for cognitive assessments. And within that, just over 100 had longitudinal follow-up. And we gave them a series of cognitive tests to do. We took blood samples to look for brain injury proteins, and we performed MRI scans to look at the brain structure. And the great advantage of these cognitive tests were that they'd already been performed on thousands of people. So it was possible for us to match the cognitive scores of our patients to what would have been expected for 8 to 10 people matched for age, sex, and education status to look at whether their cognitive scores deviated from what one might expect.
That's so interesting. So obviously the scientific paper is full of technical terms, but please could you explain in layman's terms, in order of importance, what are the key findings of the paper?
So I think there are several key findings. Probably the main ones are that in this cohort of patients, their cognitive scores were across the board lower than one would expect for their matched control participants. And that cognitive impairment wasn't specific for any one particular part of cognition, but was rather global across the different cognitive domains tested. And really interestingly, these cognitive impairments actually correlated with the presence of brain injury proteins in the blood, as well as reduced volume of specific regions of the brain on the brain scan. And those that scored the very worst in their cognition were those who had had cognitive impairment, so what we call delirium or encephalopathy during the course of their COVID-19 illness. And there also was a degree of correlation between the severity of the COVID illness and their subsequent impaired cognitive scores. But for those patients who were able to do follow-up, there was some degree of a recovery trajectory in many. But for those that underwent a second further follow-up assessment, there was a degree of plateauing or leveling off in that recovery trajectory.
Mhm. And what are the implications for the study of this area of research?
So I think the main implications are that these findings from this study indicate that hospitalization with COVID-19 is associated with objective, quantifiable, measurable cognitive deficits, even 12 to 18 months after hospitalization. And that these deficits occurred both in those with and without a clear neurological diagnosis, suggesting that actually COVID-19 infection itself is sufficient to cause these cognitive impairments. And this association between cognitive impairment and biological markers in the blood and on the brain scans of brain injury suggests that there are mechanistic processes under this that can be studied and that really underpin these changes. In earlier work, we'd shown that there was an early adaptive and innate immune dysregulation associated with these same brain injury proteins in the blood. And these immune processes, at least in the blood, seem to decline actually as time goes on. suggesting that perhaps if there is an ongoing immune response, it might be more localized, i.e., within the brain itself. What was really striking was that these cognitive deficits were equivalent to a 50-year-old scoring similar scores to one would expect for someone in their 70s. So research now is desperately needed to focus on the longer-term follow-up of these patients and really critically to identify who's at risk of worse cognitive impairment, and really to determine to what extent this is specific to COVID-19 or actually might be reflective of other infections, perhaps more common infections now outside of the brain, like seasonal influenza.
Right. And what are some of the limitations of the study?
So, as I say, the study focused on hospitalized patients. We did that so that we had really robust clinical data on how patients were at the time of their COVID-19 illness, including their routine blood markers and clinical evidence of neurological complications. But research now really needs to look at whether similar cognitive impairments are present in patients who weren't hospitalized with COVID, and really using these biological platforms like looking for brain injury biomarkers and the MRI protocols we've developed so we can evaluate this in community cohorts. Another limitation is that we pre-specified specific regions of the brain that we thought were likely to be important around those cognitive tests on which the study was based. And there's an awful lot more work now to be done looking in a more agnostic approach at what other regions of the brain and what other functional processes in the brain might be at play here.
Mm-hmm. And what are the next steps you'll take to overcome these limitations?
So what we're doing now is we're following these patients up longitudinally over time, over the many years, to look at their cognitive recovery or decline trajectories, and really also delving into potential genetic risk factors that might contribute to this. But now that we've studied this and have this really detailed understanding in hospitalized patients, we now want to do similar work in community cohorts, and really delve into whether there's elements of the neuroimmunology, the neurobiology, the brain injury, and genetic factors all taken together alongside clinical factors that will best help us understand the longitudinal recovery or decline trajectories in these patients. Because when encephalopathy or delirium is induced by infection, this is probably one of two things. It's either a red flag for people who have evidence of an incipient neurodegenerative process that might become apparent some years later, or it might actually be telling us that there's a decline in someone's cognition due to that acute inflammatory response, which potentially could be addressed by therapeutic measures in that very early stage. Whether it's a red flag or an accelerant of cognitive decline, either way, this represents a really unique opportunity to identify these patients and intervene early.
Thank you so much for describing the study. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just to say a huge thanks to all the patients involved. Thanks also to our patient and public involvement team who've been with us from the inception of the study all the way through running it, interpreting the analyses, and helping with the dissemination, particularly Encephalitis International, the Neurological Alliance, and the Stroke Association and MQ, without whose help really this sort of research absolutely wouldn't be possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.